So I'm very excited to be the person to be able to welcome you. My name is Jennifer Kavanaugh. I am the Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives and Continuous Improvement with E3 Alliance. It is a pleasure to work with you, most of you I know and have worked with. And for those of you that are new, we appreciate you being here and being part of this E3-3D from E3 Alliance. Very excited to co-present with my colleague today, Dr. Andrea Drax, who is our Director of Research, that will really help us dig into some of the data that we saw this last academic year in 2020-2021, just to really help us gain some insights and start building the narrative of how we can best support our students and really think about what systems within our education that we can alter or that we need to change to ensure that all our students are having the level of success that we want and expect from them. Let's look at our agenda for today. So we'll have some brief introductions, which I've kind of just done, and then we're going to look at our data review. We're really going to hone in on this last academic year and look at our data and what it says about those students that were remote and those students that attended school in person, just to give us kind of a perspective of what that looked like across the Region 13 area. And then we're going to look at STAAR performance. What did our STAAR performance look like in last 2020-2021? And then look at that performance in relation to those remote and in-person learners. Really focused on that Region 13 area, but do have a glimpse of what that looks like across the state as well. And then have some general overall findings and summary. And from that data, we're really excited to then go into some breakout sessions where we have some of our school district leaders and some E3 colleagues that are going to lead us in sessions around some areas that we've identified as a really key and vital to both student and educator success. Thinking about things like educator quality, accelerated learning, school culture, and social emotional learning. And then we'll have an opportunity at the very end to kind of recap and really hear what did we learn in those breakout sessions, or what was some of the ahas that we walked away with in those breakout sessions. And then a closing. Now that we have this data and this information, what more do we need to ask ourselves of both the data and our students, our teachers, and our families to get that lived experience to really help us build the entire narrative of what last academic year looked like and how we can continue to develop those innovations within our schools to ensure that our students are set up for success. As we are going through this hour and a half with you, we encourage you to use those hashtags, hashtag data-driven decisions, hashtag Central Texas ED, so that if you hear something that's really interesting or that you think is important for others to hear, we encourage you to go ahead and share it on your social media and use those hashtags. When we look at this data, one thing that's really important that I want us to think about is what can this data tell us, right? When we're looking at this data, what can it tell us? What it's telling us is really looking at that attendance from last year. How did our students attend school? Were they remote predominantly? Were they in person? When we look at that remote and in person, what did it look like across demographic profile, both for our gender students, our female and male students, looking at our race and ethnicity, and then looking at our socioeconomic levels as well. And then looking at grade level. Did that look different across our grade levels, or did we see any patterns or trends or notice anything within those grade levels? And then we also look at transitions. Transitions looks at if I was remote in the fall or sometime in the fall, but then I transitioned to an in-person attending class in the spring or vice versa. So that's what that transition means. Did I go from one form of attendance to another within that given academic year in 2020-2021? And then looked at how did our students perform on STAAR in 2021? Right, so we know that we administered STAAR this last academic year. We have those results, and so we want to get a glimpse of how did our students perform at certain grade levels. We're not going to look at every single grade level given the amount of time, but we're going to look at those key grade levels that have been identified for years as key predictors of student success, both in literacy and math foundational skills. And then are there differences in performance for remote and in-person learners, right? There's been a lot of conversation about this. There's been a lot of assumptions. There's been a lot of theories about students who are going to perform better, whether they are in person or remote. And so we're going to look at that and see where our assumptions true based on what the quantitative data is telling us. It's really important as we look at this data to really consider, right, that we were in a pandemic. So therefore, this data is not as reliable. And I say that and give two examples. So look at these two examples. On the left, you're looking at chronic absenteeism rate, right? If you're familiar with E3, we do a lot of research and reporting around chronic absenteeism because it is a key predictor of on-time graduation and also matriculation into post-secondary. Look at, if you notice, that line goes severely drops in 2020, right? And we know there was a pandemic. And so when we think about those particular numbers, does it cause some concern? Absolutely. But are we going to panic and immediately assume that we have a ton more students chronically absent and we need to go in and enforce a ton of strategies, knowing that during this academic year, if a student was diagnosed or exposed with COVID, they automatically had to miss a number of days that would almost put them in that chronic absenteeism pool. And so thinking about that, on the right, you're looking at disciplinary referrals, right? Again, you see that sudden drop in 2020. We know we had fewer students in the classroom. So automatically you would assume there's going to be fewer disciplinary referrals. And so it's just really important as we're looking at this data today that Dr. Andrea Jacks is going to take us through, is to really understand that this is one piece of the narrative, right? It does not tell the entire story of what happened last academic year or where our students are in their learning and their ability level. That this is one piece of that narrative, and it's so important that we continue to ask ourselves questions, we continue to dig into the research, and that we also bring in that qualitative perspective from your own schools, from your own campuses, to understand what are your students and your teachers and your family saying to really build the entire narrative of this story. So with all of that, I'm excited to introduce, again, Dr. Andrea Jacks, who is going to take us through the data that I've spoke about and really give us more insight in what we saw this last academic year. Dr. Jacks?
Thank you, Jen. I am so excited to be able to present this analysis to you. So we started our analysis with a look at demographic differences between students who are attending school remotely in 2020, 2021, versus those who are attending school in person. And I just want to thank everyone also for coming here at 8 o'clock in the morning to talk about data with us. We know that this is early for some of you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to go through this with us. We hope that you will find this really interesting. I'm a data geek, so of course I find it extremely interesting, but we hope that you'll find it interesting, but also you'll find some things that are actionable as well. So before we get into the instructional model data, let's talk about what the data is, where it came from, and some things that you should know about it. So the instructional model data comes from the 2020-2021 crisis code data that schools were required to report to TEA. So normally crisis code data is used if, say, a district or a handful of districts are experiencing something like a natural disaster. And it affects learning. And so just that handful of districts will report some crisis codes to TEA. But in 2020, 2021, all school districts were required to report crisis codes to TEA. And there were 3 crisis codes that were reported. The first one was that the student is being instructed on campus. The second was that the student is being instructed through the remote synchronous method. So the remote synchronous method means that you're engaging in real time with a teacher, with other students in your classroom. You're doing it potentially on video chat or even on the phone, but you are interacting in real time during the school day. It is just that you are on a device remotely in some other location. The other way that students were learning was remote asynchronously, and that is non-real-time instruction. So you may be engaging with recorded lectures, you may be engaging with assignments, but you are not having that real-time interaction. You are able to reach out to your teachers and potentially schedule phone calls or send emails and things like that, but it is not a primary mode where you are at the same time engaging together. And for our analysis, we consolidated the remote synchronous and asynchronous learners because of small numbers on the asynchronous learner side. We have a data set that is somewhat imperfect, so we can't look over the entire course of the year to see, okay, well, these students at this time had to do remote asynchronous learning for 2 weeks because their teacher was out with COVID and quarantining. We don't have that level of data. We have a data set for the fall and a data set for the spring. The fall data was measured as of the end of October, and the spring was measured as of the end of January. And this data set we were able to aggregate at the state and education service center level. For those of you who are not familiar with education service centers, there are 20 across the state of Texas. They are regional and they cover the entire state. Normally, we're able to get our data down to a little bit lower level of analysis, but we don't quite have that with this data set. So keep that in mind as we look at the data. So for our analysis, we categorize students who attended Texas schools in 2020-2021 into 3 groups. Those who attended in person in fall and spring, and that is represented by this purple bar right here. Oh, sorry, let me make sure I'm on the right place where you can see. 1 second. That is this purple bar right here, the first one. And then those that attended remotely in the fall and spring, and that is that green bar right here. And then we have this blue bar here that represents students who attended in one modality in the fall and the other in the spring. And we call these our transition students. And so we'll look a little bit more in depth at this group in just a second. But one thing to note here is for the state of Texas, we saw that a larger percentage of students were being instructed in person through the whole year in 2020-2021. So now let's look at Education Service Center Region 13, which is our Austin region. And you can see here that there is a difference. In Central Texas, we see that more students were learning or were attending fully remote during the school year. We know that in some cases, this difference was due to district policies, what districts were able to offer, and potentially even city and county policies. In other instances, other families had the opportunity to choose their learning modality. So sometimes this is family choice or student choice. And so keep this in mind as we're looking at the data. There's both sort of individual family factors that are affecting this data, as well as geographic, district, county, city policies. So it's both choice and also institutions that are affecting who is making the decision to learn in what modality. So here is the transition learner breakout, as I discussed before. So you can see in this first purple area, we're looking at students who were in person and went to remote learning, and Region 13 is the lighter colored bar. And then in the green, we have remote to in-person. And I think what is really interesting here is we have a different transition for students in Central Texas than in Texas. Students in Texas were more likely to transition from remote to in-person learning, but we see the opposite in Central Texas. But we know that, again, local policies and the timing of pandemic surges may have affected these trends. Again, keep in mind, these are point-in-time data sets. So that may be the reason we see this difference. So to shed light on the impact of district policies a little bit further, we looked at how students were categorized across all 20 of the Education Service Center regions in the state. You can see that across the state, no region was fully remote or fully in person. You can also see that there are a lot of differences across the state, some of which you may expect and some of which may be a little bit different from what you expect in terms of where different regions are falling in the order of who is learning remote versus in person. As you can see here, Austin is this third bar here, which means that we had the third lowest fully in-person attendance in the state. But if you look at the distribution, the first two had a very low percentage of students who were attending in person, and then we're a little bit closer to the next group in Texas. So that was sort of an interesting trend. And just remember This is different district policies, different education service center geographically. Some are very urban, some are very rural. This may be affected by the start of the school date, different policies at the industry level. There's a lot that is affecting this. This is not just about family choice or student choice. Okay, so now we wanted to focus back in on our region. So this is Austin's region, region 13. And we wanted to disaggregate our data by some different demographic factors. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is the differences in demographic factors, the barriers to students being able to participate in one modality or another based on demographic factors. And what we see here when we disaggregate the data by household income is that we really don't see a big difference in participation for each mode of instruction. And so that was a little bit surprising to us. However, when we break this out by race or ethnicity, we do see a difference in participation in each instructional model for the Austin region. Again, though, many systemic factors such as district and city or county policies may be influencing this data. And we do have a district breakout when we get to the STAAR data, but we don't have it for all learners. We only have it for those who took the STAAR. So you'll see that towards the end of the presentation. We also looked at the data by grade level. Here we see that high school students were most likely to be learning remotely. And this really reinforces what we're hearing from our district partners. Secondary students themselves often identified that they felt they could attend school remotely and be successful. It's also easier on families to have older students at home, whereas a younger student may cause a childcare burden in addition to trying to work, particularly if you are an essential worker and cannot be working from the home. But everyone is feeling the burdens no matter where they are right now. And then other anecdotes that we heard is that some students felt that instruction was just kind of a low base level of instruction in 2020, 2021. And so they felt like they could just get it done much easier, much faster remotely and did not need that extra engagement with their teachers during the school year. But just a reminder, these graphs don't tell us anything about students who left Central Texas School during the 2020-2021 school year. We know that a lot of students did not return and did not enroll again in 2020, 2021. This is particularly true for lower grades, but interestingly, when you look at the higher grades, you do see some small increases from the previous year. And that could potentially be because of some of those trends and some of those feelings among students and families that they felt more okay with remote learning if that's what they had to do. We also know anecdotally, we don't have this data yet, though, that many students were also leaving during the school year. So maybe they started out learning in person, they started out learning remotely, and it didn't work for them. So they were more likely to go to an alternative school, try homeschooling, or potentially even drop out or go get their GED. So we don't have that data yet. We have some data from an earlier year that we're going to start looking at to see the impact of 1920 shutdown. But anecdotally, we have heard that more students were leaving during this school year. So now let's look specifically at STAAR performance. So again, just some reminders about the STAAR. This is probably data also that you've seen some analyses of, so this may not be as new, but there are some differences in our analysis. So just as a reminder, there was no 2020 STAAR. That administration was canceled because of the full shutdown due to the pandemic. And all of our comparisons are then to the 2019 cohort and the 2020-2021 cohort. So normally we would compare 2 years right up against each other. We don't have that option here. Generally, TEA required students in 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade to pass the STAAR exams in reading and math in order to promote to the next grade. That requirement was loosened for students who were learning remotely. They were not required to come in and take that test. Some students are required to pass end of course exams in Algebra 1 and English 2 in order to graduate, and TEA did not waive that requirement for those students. So as a methodological note, as I mentioned, our numbers may differ from other analyses in a few key ways. So first, we included any student with a score on any administration of the STAAR test. So we were not honing in on a particular administration, we were looking at any of them. And we said, hey, if a student met any of those administrations, we're going to say that they met the standard. So again, not looking at a particular one, not saying you had to meet, if you took it multiple times, X number. If you met it at all, we're saying you met the standard. But the biggest source of difference is really that our analysis, because we are hyper disaggregating this data, requires full and complete demographic data on gender, household income, and race. So if students were missing any of those indicators, we did have to drop them out of the analysis. So you will see that our numbers are a little bit lower than what you may see on TEA's website, or if you look at the public data. And we were able to analyze this data primarily for state and the E3 Alliance Central Texas region, which is a little bit different from the Education Service Center region. It's our P20 Council region. We also were able to start an analysis at the district level. So we'll share a little bit of the start of that work. So because of the loosened requirements, we did see that fewer students took the test in 2021 than in 2019 in Central Texas. We don't yet have the full attendance data to compare the percent of students in attendance at the time of the STAAR test to the number of takers, but just looking at the total number of students who took the exam at each level, you can see that difference. You can also see that the 2021 end of course takers are more similar in number to 2019 than students in lower grades. So you see that the purple bar and the green bar, the purple bar is 2019, the green bar is 2021, it's much closer in those end of course exams. So while we don't yet have the attendance data, we can kind of proxy this idea of the percentage of students taking the STAAR test by comparing it to the fall enrollment totals. Again, we don't know, how many students came in since fall enrollment, how many students left, how many just decided they didn't want to take the STAAR test. So it's a really imperfect measure, but it gives us something. So when we do that in 2019, the STAAR math takers in our analysis represent between 83%, and that's for 8th grade math, and 87% of fall enrollees. In 2021, we really see that 8th grade is an outlier here. You can see that large jump for that grade. And I will say that is unique to Central Texas. We don't see that when we look at the state as a whole. And so while 3rd and 5th graders represent between 73 and 75% of fall enrollees, so not too different, 8th grade math takers represent only 48% of fall enrollees. So there was a real difference in who was taking the 8th grade math test in 2021. And in reading, we see very similar trends. And again, as I mentioned, for Texas, we see just consistently lower amounts of students taking the test in lower grades, but we don't see 8th grade being this large outlier that we see here. All right, so here we have an overall data comparison of 2019 to 2021 STAAR performance. And again, we're measuring STAAR performance as the percent of students who are meeting grade level. We know you can also look at approaches and masters. We did not do that here. We just looked at meets. And again, you can see that the purple bar is 2019 and the green bar is 2021. The number above the bar is the number that fall into that group. So that's the number that met the standard in each year. So you can see both the numbers and also the percentage. So what is interesting here on the English and reading tests in Central Texas is that students were actually more likely or on par to meet the standard in English 1 and English 2 end of course exams. But we do see this potential gap, potential learning loss in the lower grades. And I will say this is a trend that is pretty consistent when we look at the state level as well for English. But what is really concerning is this drop off for math. It is consistent, it is happening at the state level and in our region, and it is pretty extreme, this drop. So that is certainly a concern that we want to look at a little bit more. But here's where our analysis, at least to me, gets very interesting. So we've heard in the media that a lot of this learning loss, the reason why this data looks so different during the pandemic is because of the challenges of remote instruction. And there was actually a TEA analysis looking at the district level, comparing those that were highly remote to highly in person, that confirms this narrative at the district level, or at least starts to confirm this narrative. So we wanted to look more closely at this data at the student level within and across districts to really understand the experience of specific groups, particularly to be able to look for bright spots. And we're not quite there yet, but we're getting to the point where we'll be able to look at some bright spots for students during the pandemic. So this chart shows the percentages of students who met the standard in reading by level and instructional model. And the purple bar shows those students who were fully in person, and the green bar shows those that were fully remote. Again, these are students who had the same status in both the fall and the spring files and who took the STAAR exam. So this is a little bit of a different group. They had to have taken the STAAR exam, and then we looked at whether they met the standard or not. And then we took out students who transitioned in this analysis due to some small numbers, but also because we really wanted to emphasize the trends. And here you see some really interesting trends. Based on this analysis, fully remote learners appeared to have performed better on English and reading exams than those who were fully in person. So that's a little bit different than some of the narrative we've seen coming out from our partners. And I just want to say this is a preliminary analysis. We've got a lot that we want to do to delve into this data a little bit more and really understand it better. So again, keep in mind that there are differences between students who attended in person versus remote that we just can't take into account here. This is just the full summary data. So math exams, we're seeing a slightly different trend. Those who attended in person were slightly more likely to meet the standard than those who attended remote. But I think what's really important to take away here is that the differences between fully remote and fully in-person learners are not as extreme as you would expect based on the narrative that we've been hearing, and are relatively small just compared to the overall difference between 2019 and 2021. So next, we're going to look at this data by subgroup. And this is the type of analysis, the type of chart that E3 Alliance is really known for. We are disaggregating this data by gender, household income, and race. So we call these the 16-way split data because we're parsing the data out into 16 subgroups. And how you would interpret this is if you look at this top purple bar right here, this shows the percent of Asian female students from low-income households who met the standard for math on the third grade STAAR in 2019. So 56% of students in that group met that standard. It is a lot to keep in your head, all of these different things. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this data like you would if you were going to the eye doctor and looking at your eye chart 3 different times with different lenses. So the first time we're going to go through with third grade math, and then we will look at algebra 1, and then we will look at English 2. For third grade math, first we're going to look at 2019, then we're going to look at 2021 in person, and then we're going to look at 2021 remote. So one good thing to do is to find a place on the graph that you really want to focus on. So we're going to focus on Black male students from low income households for this first pass. And you can see that in 2019, 26% of students in this group met the standard. Now here is 2021 in person. And you can see that for in-person learners, 8% of Black males met the standard. And here is 2021 remote. And you can see that slightly more, 10% met the standard. All right, so let's go through it one more time. 2019, this time let's look at Hispanic males. So the bar right underneath the one we just looked at, this blue bar here, 34% met the standard in 2019. 15% met the standard if they were in-person learners in third grade math in 2021. And then 9% if they were remote learners in 2021. So we're going to do it one more time. And this time, focus on an area of the graph that's of particular interest to you. So here we go. Pick your area that you want to focus on. Here's 2019. Here is 2021 in person. And here is 2021 remote. All right, so now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at Algebra 1 this time. So let's start out by looking at the same group that we started with last time. Let's start with Black male students from low-income households. You can see 2019, 28% met the standard in Algebra 1. 2021 in person was 10%. 2021 remote was the same, approximately at 10%. All right, so let's go back. And this time we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at this full group of students from male students from low-income households. And we're particularly going to focus on our Black male students, our Hispanic male students, and our white male students. And so if you look at this data, you can see that there was a 10 percentage point equity gap in 2019 between white male students from low-income households and Black male students from low-income households. Now let's look at 2021 in person. For in-person learners in 2021, we see a jump in that equity gap. It is now 20 percentage points. And then when we look at remote, we see it's a little bit less, but still more than in 2019. We see an equity gap of 17 percentage points. All right, so we will do it one more time, and you can focus on the area of the graph that you would like to look at. Here's 2019. Here is 2021 in person. And here is 2021 remote. So some takeaways from the math STAAR results. When we're looking at student results, we see a different story than when we're looking at district results. We see that learning loss appears to have occurred just for all students. There's a pretty extreme difference between 2019 and 2021. But when we look at remote versus in-person test takers, we see a relatively small group overall, but that gap may be important for specific subgroups of students. So keep that in mind as well. And for higher grade levels, we really see that this equity gap is increasing by race. If measured by percentage points, we don't see that household income is increasing in a gap, but because those numbers are so low, if we looked at it as a percentage, we would see that the equity gap is really increasing. So here's our outlier. We're going to do this one more time. And I think just for time's sake, I'm only going to do this twice. So let's start out we're going to look a little bit different here. This time we're going to look at female students from low-income households. So this is the top group up here. And again, we're going to focus specifically on Black females from low-income households, Hispanic females from low-income households, and white females from low-income households. And so in 2019, we see that we have an equity gap of 18 percentage points. In 2021, in person, we see an equity gap of 21 percentage points amongst these students. And then for remote students, what's interesting is we see an equity gap of 17 percentage points between white female and Black female students from low-income households. But we actually see a larger equity gap of 20 percentage points between Hispanic and white students from low-income households. So that's interesting to see this shift in this group. It's important to note that each of these groups performed on par or better than their counterparts who attended in person. And they performed better than the 2019 cohort, but we do see this equity gap increasing, and it is a concern. So again, this time pick the area that you're interested in looking at. We'll do 2019. 2021 in person, and 2021 remote. So again, just to keep in mind, we are seeing district effects here. There are very different instructional models by district, and we don't know, for those who are learning remotely, at this point, how they're looking differently than the students who took the test, or between the students who took the test and those who did not what the difference is, if they are demographically different, if they are different in some other way. And so that's work that we need to do, but just keep in mind that there are district effects that are happening here that we need to explore more. And this is just within our region. So I think I've pretty well covered the summary of findings at this point. So let me go ahead and move forward. But again, if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think the one thing to keep in mind is that not only are we going to need to come back from this equity or from this learning loss for everyone, we also see some equity gaps that need to be reduced. So I just want to give you all a couple minutes to really think about this data. So first of all, there's a question of what surprised you about this data. What are the stories behind this data? What forces do you think are pushing the data up, and which ones are pushing the data down? And how might you look at your own data differently based on this data that you've seen today? So we're just going to give you 2 minutes to think about that. And if you'd like to put some of your insights into the chat, we'd love to see them. So this is a really interesting question, Katie. I am curious about that as well. We would need to get some teacher level data to really see who is teaching virtually and in person at the same time, because that seems like that would be a pretty hard burden on a teacher to do. And yes, Elizabeth, I appreciate this comment as well, that we knew that there were already disparities in the data, and there are some places where those disparities seem to be exacerbated for sure. All right, so hopefully you will continue thinking about this data, but we want to move forward and just share some of our follow-up questions, and definitely your insights and thoughts about this data will come into play as we think about what we want to do next. But some of the follow-up research questions we want to look at is, again, as I mentioned, we want to see if there are bright spots. What were these districts that were serving students, particularly when we get to the subgroup level, what were they doing well that we could potentially learn from and model and scale up as we move out of this pandemic? Again, as I mentioned, we don't know much about those students who didn't take the STAAR in 2021 in terms of their short-term outcomes. So we want to get some more data to try and look at things like high school graduation. Did they receive an industry credential? Did they complete a course? Did they pass a course? One of the things that E3 Alliance has done a lot of work with our districts on is looking at student growth models. And we have a model that requires prior years of data in order to see how a student is growing in their current year and how much growth they are having. And so we really want to look at our models, knowing that we will have at least 1 year gap, and for some students, a 2-year gap in STAAR tests to see what those models look like. Are they valid? How can we improve them so that we can learn more? And I've mentioned throughout this that there's potentially a lot of noise in this data. So we really want to try and get to that degree of learning loss through the noise, through a few more questions to look at this data. So of course, we know that we can do a lot with the quantitative data. E3 does a lot with quantitative data. And as we get more and more data, more and more is released, we'll be able to do more and answer more questions. But we also know that quantitative data is always limited in its ability to tell us why trends are occurring. We can identify trends, but knowing why they're happening is really difficult to see in quantitative data. And especially in exceptional times, where the data that's collected is maybe not as meaningful as it normally is because it's a lot more noisy. There's a lot more error. Folks are doing their best and it's hard to know exactly what the data means. So to answer some of these questions, we really need your help to understand qualitatively the experiences of students, families, teachers, schools, communities during this pandemic, and as we start returning to some sort of new normal. We also don't know whether the learning loss we appear to see this year will have long-term impacts on students. And of course, we don't want it to. We believe that there are many districts and campuses out there, some of whom are represented on this call. And you all are really working hard to support students through some innovative, some evidence-informed practices and programs, just in order to ensure that in the long run, these students don't become a lost generation whose learning and career aspirations and long-term outcomes are affected by learning during the pandemic. So we at E3 believe that the partners you're about to hear from are really exemplars in this work. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen to help lead us into some breakout groups where we can delve more deeply into some of these approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Very insightful. And I love the summary and the overall of really helping us break that down and understand it and see some of those patterns and trends, but also I think really key on what she just shared about what the data can't tell us, right? What are some of the pieces that we're missing? What are the questions that we still need to be asking ourselves? What is the additional data we need to look at to really complete this narrative to best understand what within our system do we need to pivot, improve, scale, to really make sure that we are accelerating students' learning so that they are prepared to transition into post-secondary in career. So I'm really excited about this next part of this presentation because, as Dr. Jacks mentioned, this is where we really get to hear from our school district partners and some of the innovations that they have done across these 4 areas to really rethink how are we building the capacity of our educators, right? We really honed in on our students, which is extremely important that we're student-centered and that's where our focus is. But we also realize that if we don't build the capacity of our educators, then it's going to be hard to accelerate the learning if we don't really focus on the instruction as well. And so we're hearing from Kimberly Raymond, who's the Deputy Superintendent of Lockhart ISD, who will share what they saw within their data that led them to do some really innovative things around educator quality and a glimpse of what the impact that they're already seeing from those initiatives that they started engaging in Lockhart ISD. And then we have Sarah Otto, who is a principal from LaGrange Middle School, which I love. We're trying to give you a district perspective, middle, high school, and then kind of an overall, but really thinking about school culture, right? When we think about attendance or engaging students, the school culture really sets the tone whether or not our students want to come to school. Beyond the fear or worry of getting the virus, it was focused on that school culture, right? If the school culture says I have a sense of belonging, that my school wants me there, that they believe I can learn, then our students are going to show up and want to attend. And so Sarah did some pretty innovative things at LaGrange Middle School to make sure that her students felt that they belonged and that they wanted to come to school and be part of the learning and that was taking place in the classroom. And so she's going to share some of that with us. And then we have Bobby Garcia, who's our principal at Manor New Tech High School and Manor ISD, who really honed in on that social emotional learning. We've heard a lot about that, not just in this last, what are we at, 2 years, 2.5 years, but really dug deeper into it and developed some innovative things on his high school campus to ensure that our students' needs were met, because he really understood that if students' social needs are met, then their academic needs will be met and will be successful. And then we're going to look at accelerated learning, and I'm actually going to be leading that breakout session based on a lot of innovations that we've heard throughout multiple school districts, kind of lump those to really share those out and understand what do we mean by accelerated learning? What does that look like? And what are things that school districts are doing across our Central Texas region to really step up to accelerated learning? I hope that 30 minutes was really enriching and engaging for everyone. I'm excited to have the opportunity to watch the recordings for the other 3 breakout sessions I was not able to attend. But I hope that you found that as a really good opportunity to understand and see those different innovations that are happening in our schools, right? We had no doubt that our educators and our leaders would be able to pivot in a time like this because they are so student-centered and they're so focused. But it's always nice to give it an opportunity to really see what is happening out there and what are some of those innovations that we may not have thought about that we could carry into our own districts or our practices. So I want to thank our presenters again for sharing out and giving us that insight. What I'd love to do now is have an opportunity to just hear kind of high level, like I said, think about it as an elevator pitch, 1 or 2 sentences, that t-shirt slogan, of just an overview of either what you heard out of the presentation or something from the discussion that you'd like to walk away with. And I'm just, some of you probably, hopefully most of you volunteered. I know in our group, we volunteered someone, but she was so amenable and excited to do it for us. But I'm gonna start with our educator quality group. So Lauren, who will be sharing out for your group?
All right, we were having such great discussion. I don't know if they saw my request, but I'm going to see if Sebastian Wren is available to share out. Had some fabulous questions during the discussion.
I can try. I wasn't really taking notes. In Lockhart, Kimberly was talking about the incredible power of having an experienced, high-quality teacher working with the students there, and the data related to that is a little depressing because as we have a teacher turnover problem that's getting exacerbated in the most recent year, but has always been there. What we have is teachers in their first, second, maybe third year who have not really, grown their wings as high quality teachers yet, who are deciding to leave the field or at least leave the district. And so Lockhart, has a 3-pronged approach to try to ensure that they have high quality teacher recruitment, retention, and training that they're starting to see some real benefits for. So that ranges from a very high quality teacher induction program to support the teachers who are new in the field to make sure that they, grow as professionals and get the support that they need throughout those rough first couple of years. And it was just in my mind and it slipped out again. Also just, trying to support the teachers and make sure that they, get everything that they need when they need it to become the high quality teachers. Oh, the other thing that slipped out of my mind was also recruitment, trying to reach out to, young teachers who are interested in entering the field to make sure that they get the right teachers in their district in the first place. So some of the student teachers being able to actually pay them to encourage them to do their student teaching in Lockhart helps them to stay in the district and helps the relationship between the district and the new teachers, to make sure that they're getting the right teachers, the high quality teachers, the teachers with the criteria that they're looking for, especially bilingual in this case. So yeah, I mean, we didn't have enough time, unfortunately. I think there were a lot of questions and a lot more discussion to have, but it was a very good discussion.
Thank you, Sebastian. Appreciate the overview. Very important discussion. And yeah, Lockhart's doing some really innovative things. And, one of the things we keep hearing is that districts have spent a lot of time on recruitment. And what this pandemic has really highlighted is that the importance of retention, right? Retaining our teachers and what effort are we putting into that and what resources. And so thank you for sharing that. That's really key. So now looking at school culture, Terry, who is going to share out for your group?
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to ask Carrie. Carrie, she volunteered to come in and share some insights. Thank you, Carrie.
Of course. Great conversations. Thank you, Sarah Otto, for sharing with us. So some key takeaways were around culture, and that culture is your brand, and everybody has an attitude around branding, right? And so that's where to start. Change the attitude. And so that requires having a person-centered approach with your leadership, with your teachers, with the people on your campus, really getting to know and getting out and being seen as a leadership and as the person to, quote unquote, I like this that Sarah shared as well, that you change the weather of your campus. So when you come out smiling and you present who you are and you say what you're going to do and you follow back up with what you say you're going to do, that really puts a different perspective of the people on your campuses and can really have a huge effect. Building relationships, right? Getting to know them one-on-one and really understanding who they are as people, both in your campus and outside of your campus. And I think those were some of the biggest key takeaways that I took from this. And I really appreciate the conversations we had.
Thank you, Carrie. That was beautiful. I can't tell you how happy my heart is as a mom of 2 kids in school right now. School culture, yes, it's our brand. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let's look at social emotional learning breakout. Lori, who's going to be sharing for your group?
Anastasia had some great insight that she's going to share with us.
Thank you, Anastasia.
Hello, everybody. Mr. Garcia, he had kind of talked about the different trials and tribulations of master scheduling and the things that they've done at their school, but keeping the scholars' social emotional needs at the forefront of all of those changes that they've made over the years. And so just the number one takeaway that I had, it just kind of was a light bulb came off, was they do their double block scheduling. And so that allows scholars to like finish a whole semester of like algebra at the beginning of the year. And so they can test in December. And then if they were to by chance not pass, they could, again, they still offered the EOC again in the spring. And so what kind of clicked with me is that could really reduce the anxiety of a scholar. Like, you know, when you're taking class all year and you just know you have this chance to take the test at the end of the year, but kind of taking that away, taking that factor out and being able to take the test in December and still having that, you know, in the, you know, just knowing that you have more time and just those things that they do for their scholars, taking anxiety away as they build their master's schedule. I think that's what contributes to their attendance. Their higher attendance rates, especially during the pandemic. So that's what I really enjoyed it. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys, is just taking some of those things away, those anxieties that scholars have when you're building the master schedule, what that can do overall for your culture and campus.
Thank you, Anastasia. That was wonderful. And how wonderful to call scholars. I love that. Our scholars. Thank you for sharing. And last but not least, the Accelerated Learning Group. We're going to have Sonia share out.
Okay, so I'll make this fairly quick. And so accelerated instruction. So it's basically the delivery of instruction. We talked about how it's not going fast. It's actually understanding what the critical elements that you need to teach and how it's connected, vertical alignment, how important that is, whether it be in elementary all the way up into middle school and high school. Innovative measures around that. I work at an elementary that's a leader in me. So being able to build the leadership aspect and having the students take ownership of their learning is really important, but also having the collaboration with the teachers on that as well as the content. In elementary, I mentioned that PLCs is important by grade level to work on what those critical elements are that need to be taught. And then also the department heads and anyone that works vertically. We also have vertical teams in elementary working on what that looks like, because every teacher has to know the critical elements that were needed before and now in their grade level. Also, I am an advocate of small group, and I'm an advocate of small group. And we talked about this, what that looks like to facilitate small group and have the students collaboratively work and have them take ownership for their learning that's in elementary on up, middle school and high school as well. So that was kind of our take from that.
Thank you, Sonia. What a great way to kind of end this presentation or this event that we've had with you, really honing in on those innovations, right? As we look at that data that Dr. Jack shared with us, it really gave us a perspective of what other questions do we have of this data, right? What other things do we need to be looking at? But then to really go in to see what are our school districts doing to combat what they're already seeing with their own data, right? What have they identified and what innovations have they started implementing is really powerful. So I just want to thank you for spending your morning with us. Please know that these recordings and resources will come to you in an email in your inbox. We also have our data website, which is data.e3alliance.org, where you can go and see a lot more data. And as new data is unfolded by our research team, that data website is always updated with the latest and greatest data. And then in addition, you'll be getting a link to a Menti survey. As always, we appreciate feedback. We love having these events. We think they're really important as a community and as educators to engage in this data collectively together and have opportunities to discuss. And in order for us to continue doing this and do it well, we need your feedback on how the event went, what you liked and what you'd like to see more of. So we appreciate your time this morning. We appreciate all you do for students. And we just encourage you to continue being innovative and wish you best in health. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great day.